Hello, everyone. We're going to start. We have a bit some delay because we are waiting for people from the previous sessions. Welcome, welcome. I see more and more people joining. We will start soon, waiting for the previous sessions to finish. Welcome, welcome. In a few minutes, we will start. Hello, everyone. It's time to start. 22 people. I still have people joining. 23. You are here. Perfect. Welcome, everyone. Session of now is about agile models, agile frameworks. So you might know there are many models in agile, and we might have the tendency to copy those models. That's fine. That's fine. Today we have a special guest, Cliff Hazell, who is co-founder of Flight Levels Academy, previous worker at Spotify, will tell us how to go beyond copy-paste model, copy-paste agile. Cliff, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here and wonderful to be able to spend the next hour or so with all of you here today. Cool. So thanks, Jerome, for the introduction. I will just jump straight in and get started. So let's see if my slides are working. Maybe you can type in the chat. I'm going to be asking quite a few questions as we go at different points, so it'd be super cool to hear. I'm curious if any of you know where this is, the picture that you see on your screen. Where is this? Wow, that's a first guess straight out the gate. I like it. This is correct, Thomas. It is in fact Cape Town, South Africa, which is my original hometown. It's a wonderful spot if you ever get the chance to visit. Great wine, lovely weather, and really some pretty awesome people. So I highly recommend it. Anyway, I was hanging out here in Cape Town, South Africa in this lovely space And then I met some people from another company, and they invited me to come and hang out here in the cold and darkness way up north. Does anybody have any idea where this city is, perhaps? I see a couple of people who have for sure traveled around. I guess I find interesting how often in European countries people know what the other capitals are like, because I think people travel around a fair amount. This is in fact Stockholm, Sweden, where I live right now. And I was invited to join the company Spotify. And when I joined the company, we were about 700 or so people. This is in 2013, if I remember correctly. And when I left 4.5 years later, it was almost 5,000 people. In the same time, went from around 10 million customers to around 200 million customers. So a pretty wild, crazy journey. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories and things, but I just want to kind of set the stage a little bit, is that some of my experiences come from the work in this city and in Spotify, but also from work that I've done in South Africa and other companies since then. And I'm going to tell you a couple of interesting stories. Let's start first with this one, though. So the story goes that a kid is watching their parents cooking dinner, and they are making a roast chicken. And for those of you who have kids, you know that the most common question that children like to ask is, of course, why? Why do you do this? Why do you do that? Why does this happen? So as the parents put the chicken into the oven, the kid notices that they cut a little piece off the top end of the chicken before they put it into the pan and slide it into the oven. The kid, of course, asks the famous question, why? Why do you do this? The parents look at each other and they realize they actually have no idea. And they say to the kid, well, we don't know. We learned this from our parents. So they go and ask the grandparents. Turns out they have no idea either. They learned it from their parents. For the sake of a good story, the great-grandparents are still alive. So a couple of weeks later, they plan a visit. They go out and they ask them this fantastic question. Why do you cut a little bit off the top of your chicken? Great-grandparents pack out laughing and they say, well, my dears, when we got married, unfortunately, we didn't have so much money. We couldn't afford a very big oven, and therefore our pan was quite small. So the only way to fit the chicken in the pan and thus in the oven was to cut a piece off the top. Now, you might be wondering why I tell you this story, partly because I think it's kind of funny, but I think also because what it does is it represents a little bit of what I see happening in a lot of companies. We do this in our personal lives. We do this in organizations. We see somebody else doing something like the Spotify model or OKRs or whatever the latest flavor is, and we copy it into our organization and try to do the same thing. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that copying and learning from others is a bad thing, but I'm going to explore a little bit of the nuance behind some of the challenges that you might face if you do this without realizing whether or not your oven is actually small or not. Because as the story goes, you could end up wasting quite a lot of chicken, in fact. So for me, part of what this is about is really about having a perception and an understanding of what the organization is capable of. And very often what you find is during the interview or hiring process or some sort of a sales pitch, the organization will describe themselves as if their oven is wonderfully shiny and beautiful. They've got all of the latest new technology and everything is just kind of smooth and amazing. The reality, however, is that once you get inside the organization, you might realize that there might be some differences in the perception of how the company looks from the inside. So it could be that you also have a fantastic mode of cooking, but it is in fact based on fire instead of electricity, which of course might change a couple of things. Of course, we've all had the bad experience where maybe you were sold something like this and you get inside the organization and you find out, maybe it's a little bit more like this. And occasionally when things go really strange, it maybe even looks a little bit like this. So you might be asking yourself, why is this perception factor so important? Well, for me, the issue really is that if you're looking at your organization and trying to decide how to improve and what changes to make, if your organization is any one of these three different things, you will have very different capabilities and possibilities of what the organization can achieve. For example, if you try to heat a cup of coffee in your pizza oven, perhaps a little bit strange and quite difficult to do. However, also making a pizza in a microwave, this could be a challenge, right? So the point I want to make here is really the key thing is to understand how the organization actually functions based on our real understanding of what the challenges are that we face before we make decisions about what solutions we should be using. So we're going to explore this a little bit through the idea of how do we move beyond this sort of topic of copy-paste agile. And I want to suggest that we explore this through 3 different lenses, right? So we have the lens of systems, how the parts of an organization and the system around us fit together. Science, which is really looking at observation and experimentation. And Sapiens, which is taking into account all of the wonderful diversity and amazing things that human beings can bring to an organization. Cool. So I would encourage you during the talk to fire off any questions that you have in the chat. I will try to kind of answer a little bit as we go if there's something that is relevant or maybe something is a little bit not so clear. But we will also hopefully have enough time to be able to do sort of a bit more deeper dive in Q&A at the end as well. So cool. It's also, of course, nice as a speaker in a pre-COVID world, I would see your faces and be able to see if you're smiling or if you're looking bored. And so any interaction in the chat is super helpful for me because I don't get to, unfortunately, see your faces today. And so the chat is what we have. Cool. So let's jump straight in with the first one. So systems. That's perfect, Cedric. I like it. So systems, or as I call it, interactions between the flight levels. So I imagine that quite a lot of you are a little bit tired of feeling like this inside your organizations, right? You're some sort of manager, leader, scrum master, or you work in multiple different projects, something like this, and you're constantly being dragged from one thing to the next, right? I'm imagining that this is perhaps quite a common thing because it's certainly been the vast majority of my work experience and so on. And I think part of the challenge is that what actually happens inside an organization is that it looks a little bit like this, but a lot of what we're doing both as managers and leaders, but even as individuals on a personal level, is essentially looking at this picture of a traffic jam and going, well, if you zoom in a bit, you can see there's some gaps between a few of the cars. And so what we should do is actually be more efficient and put some more cars on this road, because that would be efficiently using our resources, time, and capabilities, right? Now, I think for me, this is obviously a challenge, and it's a little bit absurd when we look at it through this lens, but the reality is that we are still doing this. So why? Why do we do this? Well, I think for me, part of what happens, if we look at a sort of typical team board, we have something a little bit like this, right? We visualized something like a backlog, next, develop, and done. Right? This takes a very development or software development view, but it could be that the develop stage is hire some people, it could be building financial reports, it could be marketing campaigns, whatever it is. But the reality is that if we ask the question, well, what happens when it's done? Does done mean it's delivered value to a customer? And well, usually the answer is that actually there's something else a little bit in between here, something like waiting for integration. And maybe if we scratch around a little bit further, what we start to see is that there's maybe something like waiting for acceptance, and perhaps even something like a release bucket that has to happen, right? We don't tend to finish something on a Friday and immediately make it go live. It might wait for the next marketing campaign, something like that, yeah? And of course, we do these things perhaps on a monthly or a quarterly basis, right? So not necessarily the most agile release or integration cycles, but this is the reality for a lot of organizations. However, at this point, we are now done and something is in the hands of the customer. But of course, we have to ask the question of what happens on the other side. Because in reality, we know that this is just the software development backlog or the backlog for a single team. So if we go the other way and we say, well, what happens before we end up with things in our own backlog? Turns out there are some other things that happen, right? We do some analysis work and maybe there's a product backlog of some sort, maybe even some sort of pool of ideas, some steering committees, a bit of triage, some budgeting, all of this kind of a stuff, right? And of course, what happens is that if you zoom out and you start to see the entire picture and you look at how frequently we're actually doing these things, you start to see that maybe focusing on being agile over here is not the best idea, right? We're super, super agile in the software development stage, but the rest of the organization is fairly lame by comparison. Part of the issue here is that really what's happening is that we're only working in very small steps of the process, right? Those black dots are where the work is happening. And as you can see from the other parts, the red dots are where the waiting is happening. So the challenge for me here is that if we only focus on a tiny zoomed in little piece of our puzzle and our part of the process, whether this is on an individual, a team, or a departmental level, what we tend to miss is that the value creation cycle across an entire organization usually extends beyond the boundaries of a team. So What I want to put to you is that in order to do this and more effectively manage the flow of value to a customer, right? And I use value because it's a broad term. It doesn't always have to mean money. It could mean some kind of positive outcome, like the government gives you a new passport, or you can pay your taxes on time. It could mean getting healthcare services, whatever it is. But the point is that we want to try to connect those little black working dots together so that they are as close to each other as possible, and rather removing the red dots. So how do we do this? As you can see here, what we have is a visualization of the end-to-end flow. We can see the value flowing all the way from vision to value, or from concept to cash. So, in summary, the point here, you need to be able to see the full end-to-end flow of value from your company, right? All the way from vision to value and concept to cash. Now, there's another piece of this, right? In reality, many of our organizations are something a little bit like a keyboard, if you'll excuse another metaphor, right? So let's say our business is we're in the business of writing letters, right? And in this particular case, a customer has asked us to write a love letter. So what we've done is that we've essentially organized our teams into a team based on each row of the keyboard, right? Now, this makes some sense because we can't necessarily put all the marketing and finance people in the same team as the software developers and the operations and help desk and support and so on. So we organize into some smaller groups and functions. The challenge, however, is that we need to now coordinate between these areas in order to get something done. Of course, the other part is that as the organization grows, what we tend to do is specialize the teams even further, right? So we end up with a team that is super focused on product analytics, or on something about UX copywriting, or a specific part of financial reporting. And the reality that we find ourselves in is that most of what we're focusing our energy on in the organization and as Agile coaches and leaders is trying to get the team that pushes the A key to push that button as fast as possible. However, as you can see on the top left side, the customer's wish is to have a love letter, not to have a box of tons and tons of A's. This does not make for a very good letter. If you start your love letter with, maybe a little bit scary, perhaps more fitting for a Halloween prank, which is quite timely at this time of year, but certainly not a very good love letter, yeah? So what we want to try to do instead is focus on the interactions between the teams. We need to focus on creating some kind of feedback loops that connect the different parts of the organization together. We want the right people doing the right thing at the right time. So how do we do this? Well, in a flight levels world, we think of the organization as essentially made up of at least three key sort of components. On the bottom, you have operational. This is teams doing things, could be hiring people, could be building software, could be writing financial reports, running marketing campaigns, whatever it is. And what we do is we gather a bunch of those teams together and we say, you are responsible for a value stream. So you all build for the same product, the same service, the same customer segment, something like this. It makes sense that we coordinate our dependencies. And so we build something at level 2. We zoom out a little bit, and here we're tracking something much more like the projects, epics, the giant initiatives, something along those lines. And what we can start to see is how do we handle the dependencies between the teams, right? Of course, most organizations have something like a strategy as well. And so what we want to try to do is connect the strategy to the coordination piece as well. So not just that we're coordinating all the projects and the work, getting everything done on time and in budget, but does it actually achieve the outcome that we are looking for? One way to think of this is if you look at this picture, for example, we are all, depending on the angle that you're standing on, if you're looking at the green side, the red side, or the blue side, you're not necessarily seeing a completely different shape, although what you're actually looking at is just a different perspective on the same object, right? And what we're trying to do here is actually bring together multiple different perspectives so that we can see a more clear picture of the whole. Nobody says that strategy is somehow better than operations or better than coordination. You need some element of all three, but the key thing is that they need to somehow be connected together. It doesn't make sense if we are fantastic at strategy, but we can never actually deliver on it, or we have the world-class operations, but a garbage strategy, or quite simply, as is fairly common, we've got great operations and strategy, but we have no ability to coordinate and prioritize. We're just overloading people with 1,000 different things in many, many different directions. What I want to put to you here is that the point of what we're trying to do in this space is to go beyond the team level. We need to stop focusing on Agile as only something we do inside a single team, squad, or unit of delivery. We have to start to connect the operations to the strategy so that we can make better decisions. So, in summary, this point on systems, we need to do two things, I think, as a key starting point. We need to visualize the end-to-end flows all the way from the idea to when it is delivering value, concept to cash and vision to value. The second piece is connect the strategy and the operations together. And in many organizations, what this means is actually tying the coordination pieces together so that we don't have a situation where there are 17 project managers, each pushing the most important project for them. But in reality, it doesn't necessarily make sense across the entire organization. We want to try to make sense across the entire pool. If you're curious to read more about specifically topics that explore this space of the systems part of my talk, two books I can recommend. Firstly, on the left side, we have Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. A fantastic book, talks about examples of systems thinking in real life situations, from organizations to sanitation to government to ecosystems. Really, really fantastic book for getting into systems thinking. And of course, on the right-hand side, the book written by my business partner and co-founder of the Flight Levels Academy, Klaus Leopold, the book called Rethinking Agile. As the subtext says there, why Agile teams have nothing to do with business agility. Really great if you want to explore this topic a little bit further. Cool. So if you're with me so far, that is the piece about systems. Now I want to change tack a little bit and talk about science, or as I call it, observation and experimentation. So I used an example of a board earlier. We had a look at this. And what I want to do is kind of ask the question of, well, what happens when we end up here, right? So when something is actually done, and let's assume this is done from a customer perspective, are we actually looking at something that is an output, or is it an outcome, right? Because in many organizations, there's actually a step beyond simply just delivering the thing. We have to deliver in order to be able to achieve an outcome. But if we deliver 10 more widgets and none of them deliver any value, or one of them actually delivers all of the value, it's probably helpful that we know that. In a lot of organizations, some of you may know the underpants gnomes from South Park. But in a lot of organizations, really our sort of approach to getting to some kind of value or to profit is a little bit like this. We don't really understand what it is that produces the value. We know that the company makes money, but we don't know what that phase 2 is, right? So the story goes in the South Park episode that their plan is to collect all the underpants. There is this sort of mysterious phase 2, but somehow out the other side, they're going to make profit. The challenge is that if we don't know what generates the profit or the value, it's very hard to optimize the organization for actually doing more of those things and less of the other things. Part of the challenge here, as Jonathan Haidt explores in this book, The Righteous Mind, is that the human being or the human mind is more of a story processor than it is a logic processor. And what we like to think about ourselves is that what we do is we look at some data and we analyze the data, and then we reach a conclusion and make a decision at the end, right? The reality, however, is that what we tend to do is use our intuition to make a decision and then use our rational reasoning capability to construct a story that explains why we made the decision. We do this all the time, and this is just something that I think is very helpful to be aware of, because this can lead us into certain traps, right? The second part of this for me is what Annie Duke calls, in this book, she calls it resulting, which is our tendency to judge the quality of a decision based on the outcome, right? So if I play a hand of poker and I win, I assume that I am a good poker player and I was good at that hand. But it discounts the role of luck and everybody else in the game from contributing to whether or not that was a good decision. However, a way that you can look at this is to say, well, what were the odds, or statistically, what was the probability of me being right here? Was it a good decision to have made in all situations? And so we want to get better at this, not just looking at, well, we were successful, but actually understanding, were we successful because we made a good decision or simply because we were lucky? So you might be asking yourself the question of, well, how do we do this, right? I've explained a lot about what the problem is. For me, the simplest way to start with this is to, when you start out doing something, write down your hypothesis, right? So I think that if we did this thing, X, Y, Z would happen. Quite simply, what this allows us to do is to reflect on this in the future. So now that we've done and delivered something, we can start to see what the actual outcomes were, right? So I had a plan of collect all the underpants, and that was going to make profit. We've collected all of them. What profit have we made? What is the actual outcome that we have achieved as a result of it? And the difference between expectation and actual outcome, that is giving us some opportunity to learn. A simple way to ask this question is to say something along the lines of, if we had this today, what would the benefit be, right? If we had that product or feature, we had this kind of a system, that way of coordinating, whatever it is, what would the benefit be, right? You can start to use this to understand what you should focus on. The second piece of this is to ask the question of, well, what assumptions or what would need to be true in order for this to work, right? We would need to have everybody doing things perfectly in sync. Now, is that likely to happen? I don't know. But you can start to test out what are your assumptions that are built into the outcome that you are hypothesizing about. So the point for me here, quantify your hypothesis before you start and keep reflecting as you go. And most importantly, to reflect after you've delivered and see what the actual result is. Yeah. There is a second piece to this, however, if we're using science. And you might find yourself often in the situation of finding yourself looking at this and going, but there's still space, you know. We don't want our people sitting idle because, well, they're expensive and so on. If you're doing this, one of the things that I think can be super helpful, and this is an example, this is one of the tribes that I worked with at Spotify. Draw your attention specifically to where the arrow is pointing, the green items on the top right. These items are called current bets. And what this is, if you remember back to when I talked about flight levels, these are the items from the strategic level, so from level 3, that are reflected on a level 2 coordination system. So this is a visualization across 120 odd people's work. And what we can see here is how the things that we are doing on the left side of the board actually map to the company's strategic priorities. The key factor here, however, is that they are actually sequenced, right? There is a number 1, there is a number 2, there is a number 3. And one of the simple ways that we handle this inside the organization is to say, let's make sure that we have a situation where we don't let number 3 block number 1. Yeah. So what this means is not never ever work on number 3. It simply means only work on number 3 if it wouldn't affect working on number 1. So don't pull people off number 1 to help out with number 3, right? Don't say you're busy working on number 3 when you could help out with number 1. And if somebody needs you to work on number 1, you should stop whatever you're doing to help out on number 1. Yeah. The point here is to try to avoid making traffic jams and keeping the number 1 thing flowing, right? You can spend as much effort as you want further down the pipe, but try to do it at least roughly in order. Are you with me so far? So, 2 books that I can suggest to explore this topic a little bit further. First one is Escaping the Build Trap by the wonderful Melissa Perry, talking about how to create a kind of hypothesis and a strategic product delivery framework. Highly, highly recommend this book, especially if you're trying to get your organization into better product management. And the second piece is Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. Much more of a general kind of about how to think better about decision making. The subtext of the book is making smarter decisions when you don't have all the facts, which is, I think, most of the time our reality. So quickly to recap on the science piece, 2 things that I think are super helpful here. Quantify your hypothesis, write it down, reflect and learn before you start. Yeah. And secondly, don't let number 3 block number 1. Try to be clear on what your most important priority is, and this will help you avoid making traffic jams. Cool. So I have one more topic for you, and then we will kick it over to some questions and see what you would like to know more about or what you found interesting. So Sapiens, for me, this topic is really about the wonderful diversity of human beings. And as we've already explored, we really want to try to create this connection between all the different parts of an organization. But some of you may have possibly heard this. Have you heard this? People resist change. Have you heard, or maybe you've experienced something a little bit like this in your organizations before? Yeah. I think very often what we do is we kind of make this assumption, And there's sort of a slightly darker version of this that I heard a couple of times, which is that people either won't work or they won't work on those things unless we tell them or we tell them what to do. Now, the challenge for me is that this assumption often rests on the idea that you either have the wrong people or that you have bad people in your organization. And if you'll sort of follow me down the path of another metaphor, essentially it's basically saying that you have dead wood inside your company. Now, I want to put it to you that if you have dead wood inside your organization, there's really only two ways that it got there, right? Either you hired dead wood or you hired live wood and you killed it, right? So the point for me here is what we want to try to do is stop doing both of these two things, right? It's entirely possible that you could maybe have hired somebody who just doesn't really get what is going on in this organization. Not everybody is meant to fit with every company culture and organization. And I say that cautiously, but I think it is a possibility. The more common thing that I see is people arrive excited to do a good job, and within a couple of months or a couple of years, they've had it beaten out of them, squashed out of them, and they're no longer motivated and excited about what they do, right? Maybe you've experienced this in your own life. Maybe you've seen it happening with people around you. And I want to explore a little bit about why I think this happens and what we can do differently. So firstly, very often when we think about organizations, we think about humans, we think about any kind of a system, what we tend to do is think about something through the lens of this. We think of it as a machine, right? The key difference here is that machines generally are replaceable, right? If your typewriter breaks, you can grab another one and just swap it in. If you've ever tried to do this with human beings, it is actually a lot harder. And it usually doesn't work so well because human beings are quite different to machines in that we are far more complex and we have a variety of different needs, motivations, and desires. And really, our performance is affected quite vastly by the environment that we are in. I think a better metaphor for thinking about how to create a healthy organization is to look at an ecosystem, in this case, a forest, right? If you want to try to create a great forest, you don't set some quarterly KPIs and put motivational posters on the wall, set some OKRs and give people targets and then shout at the trees if they don't deliver, right? We know that this is absurd, and hopefully none of you are trying this. I have heard that some people like to speak to their trees, but that's much more of a polite conversation and perhaps more beneficial to you as an individual than necessarily for the trees. The reality, however, if you want to grow a great forest, is that you need to plant the trees at the right time. You need to provide enough water, but not too much, right? Enough sunlight, but not too much. It's all about the ecosystem and the interaction between the parts. One tree gets sick, you need to take care of it. If there's some sort of bug infestation, you need to take care of it, right? It's no individual tree that makes the forest successful. It's the ecosystem as a whole. So I want to explore a little bit deeper some of the challenges that underlie why we sort of take these challenged approaches and what some of the issues are. I wonder if anyone can tell me, maybe you can just type in the chat, what's going on in this picture? What do you see happening here? Or what do you think is happening in this situation? Something like a negotiation, a boring meeting. I would suspect it's quite likely a boring meeting. Old people being old. So in the middle, the guy sort of pointing his hands forward like this is Mike Pence, who at the time was the Vice President of the United States of America. And this, believe it or not, is actually Donald Trump's Council on Women's Rights. Now, usually when I do this talk and you can hear the voice reactions, people are just like laughing or like, you. Now, my point with this is that there's really no chance whatsoever, in my opinion, putting whether you view these people politically as good or bad aside. I think there's just no chance that a group of old white men are going to make good decisions about women's reproductive rights, right? Or really about anything that affects women for that matter. So quite simply, this is obviously going to be a challenge. We have this a lot in our organizations, and it's not only old people or white people or men that is the important factor, right? What I'm talking about here is that we do this when we have maybe just all of the managers, right? Or all the people who went to university, all the product people in a room, all the designers by themselves. We very rarely tend to mix up the groups, right? And we'll explore this a little bit more as we go. Second question, who can tell me what's going on here? Does anyone know what's happening in this picture? Celebration? Yeah. Family reunion at an airport? Yeah. Adrian is actually a little bit more in the correct direction here. So this, believe it or not, and when I first saw this picture, I'll be honest, I thought it was something like a wedding or a graduation, some sort of ceremony like this. This is actually the Indian Space Agency celebrating the successful launch of the Mars lander. They did it for a 10th of the budget that anyone else has done it before or since. It's incredible success that they have here. They also did it on their first attempt. It was the very first launch, and it landed successfully. So the other part of this that I think is funny is that they actually made the Mars lander. It cost less to launch this mission than it did to make the movie The Martian. So Hollywood spent more money making a movie about going to Mars than the Indian Space Agency spent actually going to Mars. Now, the reason that I tell you this or show you this picture is that very often we don't necessarily have a correlation or see the linkage. We see these kind of people, a bunch of Indian women dressed a certain way, and our first thought is usually not scientist, and certainly not high-end, internationally successful scientist, right? Now, I don't tell you this to make you feel bad. I tell you this because I think it's important that we understand how these things work. So I want to tell you a bit of a story. Where does this come from? Well, millions of years ago, or maybe not so many millions of years ago, depending on how you interpret the stories, you might have been hanging out somewhere close to where I was born, or at least your ancestors were, and one of these comes charging out from behind the bush, right? And it comes at quite a speed towards you. And if your decision-making process is to sort of look at it and go, it's yellow, it's kind of fast, it's moving generally in my direction, looks a little bit hungry. Problem with this is that it's too slow and you're basically lunch, right? Now, none of us would have been here today if our ancestors were doing this. So what they developed instead was the ability to make very fast snap judgments about things. So what you do is you look at something and you go, it looks slightly like a lion, and you just run the hell away. You don't stick around to find out if it might be a lion, because the cost of failure in the situation is too high, right? It's the same reason why we have fight or flight reflexes. It's why you jump when there's a loud noise. It's all of these kind of things. It's an instinctive reaction to something that you have learned over time. Now, what I want to make as a point here is that all of these kinds of things tend to lead us down a path that has some both positive and some potentially negative consequences, right? If we were trying to build the best Mars lander, I imagine that a fair chunk of us would probably not immediately go and hire a bunch of Indian women. But that would mean that we were missing out on the opportunity. It can also lead us to a situation where we're having a conversation about women's rights, and we're doing it as a bunch of old white men in the room, right? Now, the challenge here is that in those situations, what I think we want to try to do is be aware of and intentionally design around the biases that we have, right? We need to be open to having a conversation about how might our assumptions perhaps be affecting a more positive outcome, right? So I showed you this picture earlier, and I want to really make this point, is that what we want to do here is try to blend these different perspectives together. As I said before, it's not that strategy or the CEO's opinion is somehow the best or better than everybody else. We need to be able to blend them together, right? It doesn't help if we have the best strategy, but nobody understands what it is. Or we have this amazing way of doing coordination, but it's too expensive and unfeasible because it doesn't take into account the operational needs of the organization, right? So what we need to be able to do is create an environment where we can more effectively blend these different diverse perspectives together. So I want to talk a little bit about how do we do this. So if you find yourself in a situation where the room or the conversation or the only people involved in the feedback discussion are all of a specific category, a specific type from a certain background, right? If you're all managers, if you're all only the senior leaders, if you're all only the designers, if you're all only men or you're all only women, try to mix it up a little bit more and invite some other folks into the room, right? Just involving a little bit broader set of people in the discussions, you will see some fascinating perspectives. I think often what happens here is that we kind of assume that if you're having a conversation about a topic, everybody needs to be a super, super expert on that topic. But the reality is some of the best feedback and insights that I have received have been from people who know nothing about the topic and look at it and go, from a completely naive and unexperienced point of view, ask a really, really insightful question. And that leads me to realize how I can make this whole situation better and what could be improved. Essentially, what I'm talking about here is that we need to be able to invite others into the room, but there is a second part here. If you are meeting a leader and you feel like the kid on the right, we still have a challenge. It's not enough that you're simply present in the ring in this situation. We need to actually make it possible that people can contribute. So if you have a situation where making a suggestion feels like this, for example, or maybe your retrospectives feel a little bit like this, perhaps even your restructures could feel like this, Or a famous one that you have most likely experienced is something like a performance review. What we want to try to do is make it so that it is a little bit more balanced and equal. And I will explore a little bit about how this works. So the point is, if we cannot get one of these perspectives into the room, or we have the people in the room, but we simply don't hear them because we talk over them or because they don't feel comfortable in raising their voice, we are going to have some challenges. It's not just about having diversity, it is also about some kind of inclusion. One way to think about it is this. If diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is about choosing the music, right? So we want to be able to create a situation where people are not only at the party in the first place, but they actually feel that they can contribute in a meaningful and productive way. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some simple things that I think you could try out in your organization that are based on some of the experiences that I've had. The first one is that very often in organizations, what I see happening is we have a very strong bias usually towards verbal communication. Now, your organization might be a little bit different, but I see this one fairly often. And I think often what the challenge is that if we only do things in a verbal form, usually the conversation goes a little bit like, here's my grand idea, this is what I think. There's very little of conversation from everybody else. Usually it's more sort of presentation style. And what it misses is that it requires everybody to kind of just think in the same verbal metaphors that you have used, but it also usually requires them to quite quickly have an opinion on that topic. What I think we can do instead is offer something like pre-reading. So instead of spending all of your time making a presentation, write down your core idea, draw a picture, send it out to people beforehand. You can still do the presentation, but maybe what you could do is frame it more as what questions do you have or what do you not understand in this idea? Give people an opportunity to do that. The second piece is that it gives people time to think, right? And I think this is something that we often overlook, right? If you ask a question and you say immediately afterwards, any questions? And then the first person to put their hand up gets to ask one question and then we move on. It's quite likely that what you haven't gotten to is really a deep level of kind of thinking through the problem in kind of all of its depth. And I see this one very often with restructures. It's done in a form of, here's something that we've been thinking about for some weeks or months. I give you a 30-minute presentation and tomorrow or next week it's going live. There's no opportunity for any of us to give any kind of an input or even ask questions to clarify if we even understood what was going on. So the second piece for me, or the third piece at least, is to make sure that you follow up, right? Don't just ask questions in the conversation and the presentation. Make sure that the day after or some days later, there is an opportunity for people to say, hey, actually, I have this question now that I've slept on it. I've thought about it a bit more. What about this or that or the next thing? Yeah? Cool. Another example of this for me, this is a simple agenda that we used for the leadership team syncs at multiple levels within Spotify. And I don't show you this because I think this agenda is sort of a highly recommended kind of structure or anything, but I want to draw attention to something at the bottom of the list here. So quite simply, what we would do, we would meet every usually 2 to 3 weeks, and there would be a conversation that went something like this. So imagine kind of the leadership for a team, and maybe the next level up, like directors or VPs, would be meeting, and there would be a conversation sort of across the level, if that makes sense. And the topics were basically, what have you achieved or learned since we last met? What are you planning to do next? What's on your minds? Fourth, what are you stressed by? And the important distinction here is the fifth one. And what of those do you need help with? Or what do you need help with? The reason that we split these three at the bottom was specifically to separate out the difference between something we were thinking about, something we were stressed by, and something we actually needed help with. Because what we would notice would often happen, and this was especially common in senior leadership or people who had a very sort of fix-it type of approach to things, they would assume that something that was stressing me out was something that I needed help with. It was quite often the case that that was not the thing I needed help with, or the way that I wanted help was actually quite different to what that person was assuming. Yeah, I really think it's helpful to frame this way, because otherwise you run the risk of trying to be helpful but ending up actually inflicting help because you haven't checked if the person actually wants some help or even needs it in the first place. There's a lot more that you could explore in this, but two specific books that I can recommend on this topic. The first one is the wonderful book by Esther Derby, 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. This explores all kinds of aspects of creating change and facilitating change and leading change within an organization. It's also a fantastic book if you're wondering, as a leader or manager in an agile organization, what should I actually do? Because I think a lot of people have this question. This book provides some really, really fantastic answers to this question. The second book by Liz Wiseman is called Multipliers. And specifically in this book, what I found particularly fascinating, there is a table that talks about different kind of characteristics that people often see as their strengths. So, for example, being very decisive or being good under pressure, these kind of things. And she explores some situations where that strength can actually be counterproductive and a weakness. And so what it really helped me to do was to see where things that I was seen as and often got feedback on as a really strong characteristic, where I should use it and where maybe I should back off and either let somebody else play or use something different instead. So that brings me more or less to the end of the talk, and I want to just kind of summarize a little bit and sum it up a bit for you. But first, I want to just kind of touch on this topic is that very often one of the things that I hear from people when I talk about these kind of things is this challenge of, well, coaching and teaching and developing the organization is really, really expensive. And I will agree that this is something that takes time. The challenge for me is that very often the question kind of comes from a place of, well, what if we spend all this money on people and train them and they leave? So what if we train them and they leave? And I want to ask you the question rather is to think about it, well, what if you don't and they stay? This for me is the challenge, right? We have lots and lots of people who we would hopefully like to keep within our organization. It probably makes sense that people should be developing and learning further. So I opened with this question of how do we move beyond copy-paste agile? I want to quickly summarize the 3 points. We talked about systems, right? Creating interactions and feedback loops all the way end to end across the value stream and across all flight levels. So not just left to right across the value stream, but also vertically between strategy and operations. Secondly, we looked at science, right? And the shift from just being focused on outputs and trying to focus more on the outcomes and using hypotheses so that we can quantify, reflect, and learn from them. And thirdly, we explored the wonderful diversity of human beings, and we looked at some different ways that we could design around our biases to be able to leverage different diverse perspectives and see a more complete picture of the whole and thus make better decisions. So this for me is how we explore or build the missing links between strategy and operational agility, right? It's not enough to just have one or the other. We actually need to think about the organization as a holistic thing. So, as I said at the beginning, if you're tired of constantly feeling like this, one last thing that I can suggest to you is to explore some of the work that we're doing at the Flight Levels Academy, right? We have a thing called the Introduction to Flight Levels. It's a self-paced video course. You can run through it quite quickly. It takes sort of 2 to 4 hours, depending on how deep you go on the exercises. There is even a discount code for those of you who are interested. And I will make the slides available to you so that you can have a copy of the slides, but also the discount code and so on if you would like. And the second thing that I can offer is just to tell you a little bit about some of the other things that we're doing. So we stream on YouTube every 2 weeks, and we talk to people like Esther Derby about the book that she wrote. We talk to folks like Troy McGinnis about the impact of dependencies, a whole bunch of different episodes. There's about 30 of them now, and you can check us out on YouTube and on Meetup. Last thing to say to you is to say thank you for lending me your ears and giving me your time. I'd love to explore some questions further with you, both in the chat now and on the session. And of course, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing, what resonated with you, or maybe something you'd like to clarify, or so just tell me about what you're up to. I'd love to hear more. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Cliff. Thanks. It does resonate a lot to me, so I guess it does resonate for many of us. Many tips, many new books to read. Thanks for that. Maybe you can ask questions. There is still the Q&A tab where you can ask a question. I see already one from Gilles. What do you call flight levels?
Yeah, so the idea of flight levels is basically where it came from, was this thing of noticing a lot of organizations basically very focused on making individual teams agile. And at the end of the day, very often not really realizing that there was more beyond that. So we have super, super fast teams, but this ends up being a little bit like, driving a Ferrari in rush hour traffic between traffic lights. Very, very fast when you get to move, but very, very slow the rest of the time. And so what we realized is actually you need to think about the organization in those 3 levels. So what we want to do is connect the operations through coordination to strategy and vice versa. There should be some coherence all the way up and down the organization. And so what we've developed is basically a couple of different metaphors and ideas. So the idea or the metaphor of flight levels is essentially, if you think about it, if you fly low, close to the ground, like in a small plane or something, you see quite a lot of detail, but you don't see so much breadth. You don't see very wide. Whereas if you fly really high, you see very, very wide, but you lose the detail, right? And it's not that either of these perspectives is better or worse than the other. They're just different views on the same landscape. But what we need to do is actually connect these two together. And so what we focus on with Flight Levels Academy is helping folks to actually understand how to do this. Because what we see often is this thing of like, well, we're trying to be agile over here in IT, but what about marketing and finance? Or how do we connect with the strategic leadership and the CEO and the board of the company? Because they have a lot of things that they want to do or directions they want to go in, but we also need to connect with what we're doing on the ground. And so we think about it, as I said, in the 3 different levels, because I think it's not 3 levels of hierarchy, it's just 3 different kind of viewpoints. Generally in middle management, it's mostly about coordination. Generally at the top of the organization, it's mostly about steering and strategy. And very often at sort of the ground level, it's about operations and making stuff. And we need to connect these together. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question about why do you call it flight levels, or what do you call it flight levels for? Yeah. What other questions do you have?
Thank you.
What else?
Any other questions? Yes. Use the chat or the Q&A. So Cliff, I'll let you read the chat, and we have a lot of feedback. Thank you. Very inspiring, outstanding storytelling.
Very cool. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah. Awesome.
I don't see any other question.
Cool.
Time to maybe close the session. Thanks, everyone. The conference is not over. We're going to continue. We're going to have several sessions. There will be one workshop this afternoon at 1, build, run, improve, repeat. We have another session about liberate a remote team to high performance from Michael Neer, or tips from the Agile trenches from Yves Anoul. So stay tuned, stay with us. Thank you very much. And Cliff, thank you again.
It's a pleasure. Cheers.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.